Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You are listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Well, it's the holidays and soon we'll be approaching the new year. And I'm sure many of you out there who are listening to this program today are thinking, well, my New Year's resolution is to lose weight, get fit, and just feel better all the way around. But, most of us may hold on to that 30-day to a point where we actually create a habit and maybe it'll eventually fall off as we don't see the results that we hope to achieve. So what is it that usually stops us, prevents us from being able to achieve the ideal way physiologically that we want to have? Well, with hundreds of thousands of books out there about diet and weight loss telling you many things such as counting calories, cutting out the carbs, lots of exercise, that we would think that we would be able to achieve what we're looking for. But how come America has become one of the most obese nations on planet Earth? Well, probably it's a little deeper than that. Maybe it's about what our subconscious beliefs are helping us believe we should be. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone with a very unique story that started at the age of 22 with just $300 left over from student loans. He successfully built one of the largest personal training business in the state of Florida with multiple locations and a host of trainers who were working for him. But it was pretty hard for him to maintain credibility with clients when he's 300 pounds, just as our guest did. Our guest today is a subconscious behaviorist, cognitive behavioral coach, and a clinical hypnotherapist who for more than 18 years and helping thousands of people has specialized in helping those who suffer from being chronically overweight. His new book is Fat to Fearless. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Asher Fox. Asher, how are you feeling today?
I am feeling great, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
I would imagine you do because your book isn't just about losing weight, but it's just feeling great about who you are, isn't it?
Absolutely. The premise of the book really deals with the fact that essentially the reason that people suffer from chronic obesity, that they have yo-yo diets, that especially people who have large amounts of weight to lose, that it's really driven by deeper emotional issues. It's not so much that people feel bad because they're overweight, it's more that they're overweight because they feel bad.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's take a look first of all at the messages that we get out there about who we are. And one of them that came to mind quite adamantly was that show, The Biggest Loser. What are your thoughts on a show like that?
Well, the challenge is that there's a few things with that. One, even if we just look at it from a physiological standpoint, if we look at it from a healthy dieting or weight loss standpoint, any show like that really features rapid weight loss is never really going to be good for you. One, it's not going to be good for the body, but secondly, you're also really not going to learn the skills that you need to maintain that because you haven't really addressed what it is that caused you to be overweight to begin with. Essentially, you go on a show like that and you have a great deal of pressure to lose weight, and that pressure kind of overrides everything. You can imagine what it's like being on TV. So that's one issue. But the second is that essentially the message is lose as much weight as you can, as fast as you can, and you want to look like this ideal that's kind of put out there in society, which really isn't that ideal if you kind of look at it a little deeper. So I think messages like that are very harmful from a variety of standpoints.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, too, I would think just the title of the show itself, Loser, somehow subconsciously, that is people...
There's definitely a message there.
Now, I have to say, when I came across your book and the idea for this show here, I thought, this is really an approach that our show really likes to look at, and that is we all have the tools inside of us. Sometimes it's just a matter of uncovering or opening up that toolbox, if you will, to discover that they're there, then learning how to use them effectively. And many times, as I've talked with healthcare professionals, people such as yourself, to the point where we have seemed to have surrendered this power to be able to use these tools in our toolbox to people that we think know more than we do. And a lot of times we find very little success in reaching outside of ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. We do have all the tools inside of us, but people are always looking for the tools outside of us. They're looking for the new fad diet or the new approach or the new product. And as I've said many times in a variety of venues, if the answer was out there, we would have already found it. You can go online. We live in the information age. So you can go online, and I could Google how to build a space shuttle and probably get schematics. So if there was anything out there that was some new amazing approach that was just going to work for everybody, we would find it. It's not about, new information. It's about looking within. And people surrender the tools because they really don't want to do the work because, quite frequently they're afraid of what that is. One of the key things that I talk about in the book, that the cornerstone of success, whether it be with weight loss or any type of therapy that really requires intensive change, is this simple question: have you suffered enough? Have you suffered enough with what you're dealing with now that the pain of dealing with changing things and looking at things you don't want to look at is less than where you're at? And that's the challenge, is that people just really aren't wanting to look deeper within because, quite frankly, frequently they're afraid of what they're going to find there. But the reality is that's never as difficult as dealing with the results of those unresolved issues in your subconscious and under the surface.
Well, and two, you also think about having the extra weight, what a strain that has on your body.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's, one of the things when I was, when I initially lost the 300 pounds, and I would say to my clients, and this came from very personal experience, I would say to them, how you feel when you're really, or how I feel when I'm sick, is how you feel all the time, and you just don't know that. Mm-hmm. Because you really haven't had the experience. If you've been chronically overweight your whole life, you really haven't had the experience of knowing what it's like to be healthier.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm just curious, from your experience, and we're looking at almost 20 years here, what have you found to be the common reason people are overweight?
Primarily, it's emotional eating. It's the fact that they haven't dealt with issues under the surface. They haven't really resolved a lot of those things. And from a very early age, they learn the coping mechanism of reaching for food. Mm-hmm. So it's, they're essentially trying to deal with emotional issues through substances. It's really no different than things like drug abuse or sex addiction or gambling addiction. It just happens that people that are chronically overweight, the subconscious mind always seeks the path of least resistance. So, someone asked me recently, they said, well, what makes someone reach for food versus, some other type of addictive substance? And it really comes down to a great deal your family environment that you were raised in. If you were raised in a family where you were modeled unhealthy eating habits, that was probably the easiest path to go. Or if your parents gave you food as a reward, you learned that very early on. So people typically tend to take the path of least resistance in terms of choosing whatever their drug of choice is.
That's an interesting point of view. I remember a hippie friend of mine who was big about nutrition and organics said pretty much that same thing about being rewarded with food. For instance, you got good grades and your parents took you out for a milkshake, and he was telling me a story one time about how, the way you're going, it was to a specific individual with his son, you keep doing this and you're going to turn him into a heroin addict. Yeah, interestingly enough, 15 years down the road, that's exactly what happened. First it started with, I guess maybe it was a candy or a milkshake reward, and now the kid's hooked on heroin.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was surprised by that outcome.
Well, at a very early age, people learn to self-medicate. They learn to, we don't really have the structures in our society to teach children how to use the tools that we were talking about previously to look within themselves, deal with their own emotions. And it's even worse now because now we're teaching them to plug into video games and Facebook and social media and texting. So, at a very early age, more so now than ever before, we're teaching children, hey, when you feel bad, there's something you can reach for. Whether that's food, whether that's, your phone or your video game or the computer or what have you.
And it's interesting because I just finished a segment with a gentleman that was talking about an ancient Taoist practice, and what he was saying that it does, it's a hands-on gentle massage technique that releases the emotions that can be stored in the organs. And in essence, you're pretty much saying the same thing here, that we actually begin to store and hoard this because we're reaching out for that instant gratification to make us feel better when in fact we're losing the capacity to feel, which is what we should be doing.
Yeah, very much so. The body very much stores emotion. If you've done this for a period of time, the type of work that I do, you'll see that different types of emotions felt chronically certainly manifest in terms of disease in the body. And, they're actually, over the number of years that I've done this, it's kind of interesting. People can come in and they will, even before I look at their medical history, they can start telling me some of their emotional symptoms, and I'll say, you have fibromyalgia, don't you? And they'll say, oh, how did you know that? Or you have multiple sclerosis, or, because there's definitely a pattern that I see between the emotions that people have suffered from throughout their entire life and how that's manifested in the body. And, there's certainly a lot of great techniques out there that help you to release a lot of this negative energy from the body. The challenge is that if you don't change the underlying subconscious beliefs and the subsequent cognitive structures that come from that, you just end up kind of rebuilding that up because you haven't really changed the thought pattern. But all of that is very true. Interestingly enough, I discovered this over the past several years. As people began to lose weight, it was almost like, how archaeologists can dig into the ground and they can see, what occurred at different periods of history based on the dirt at that level. As people begin to shed weight, they would have different issues that would come up for them based on, that was coming up that needed to be dealt with as they lost different, amounts of weight, so to speak. It was almost as if that emotional trauma was coded within that weight that they gained at that particular period of time, which was very interesting to see.
And that's so true, too, Asher. I remember an experience many years ago as I was in the restaurant industry, and I was working at a brew pub, and there was a couple that came in every Friday, and she was a great gal, and she was, definitely large. And it was probably about 4 years down the road, I'd moved to a different place, and she came in and she was sitting in the bar during the daytime, and she says, well, hello, Dan. And I looked at her, and for a minute I thought it was a former roommate of mine. And so that's what I actually called her by. I said, well, how are you doing, Tracy? She says, well, I'm doing pretty good, but I don't know about Tracy. And I stood there for a minute because I just couldn't figure it out. Then all of a sudden it hit me who she was. She had lost that much weight. It just blew my mind how different. Now, here was the interesting part of the story. So I got excited to see her and understand, now that I knew who she was, and we started talking, what happened to you? And she shared the interesting story about how she was involved with a law firm and that she was really just getting fed up that she not only was with them and doing what she was doing, but that her real passion and dream was to do something else. And her husband says, well, look, I'm doing pretty good in retirement. Why don't you start doing what you really want to do? And she says, really? And he says, yeah, you'll get my support 100%. Just by that simple shift, she says, the weight literally just fell away. There wasn't any diet, there wasn't any exercise, it was just that shift in her experience of life. And I said, and at that moment, I completely understood because I went through more or less the same thing, not that I was big, but there was that shift where you could just feel like this baggage just fell away.
Oh, absolutely, and that's very much addressed in Fat to Fearless, that you're really dealing with the underlying issues. People in private practice, people come in to see me for weight loss, and we really only talk about weight loss directly in the first couple of sessions. After that, we're really dealing with the emotional stuff that's underneath. And what's interesting is, how rapidly they begin to lose weight as they address those underlying issues that cause them to not only reach for food, but also, because of their belief system, causes them to feel they need to show up in the world being heavier. But frequently it's, we're not really, when they come in, we're not really so much dealing with the symptoms or the habits of, I eat at this particular time, or, I can't resist the sweets. We talk about that the first couple sessions. Then after that, we begin dealing with the underlying emotions, which is very much also Fat to Fearless in the book and that program is, it's very much, let's get underneath the surface, let's, pop the hood open and figure out what's going on here that's causing you to show up in the world this way.
And on that note, there was a weight loss show that I ran into one time, and it was a 2-hour-long show where the coach actually worked with just one person. And this one here, as I was watching the show, it was so much like what you were talking about. And here was a woman that was in her mid-20s. She was at 315 pounds. Excuse me. He felt that her ideal weight for her size should have been about 165. Mm-hmm. And he gave a program that would take 1 year for her to achieve that target weight. Okay? So, as you were saying, it isn't something that you do quick and easy, but he was doing it, But what was really amazing was throughout this 2 hours how many times I felt myself in tears watching what was going on, and then at other times you're cheering, and I'm thinking as I was observing even my own reaction to this, how on target this guy was with what the real issue was. But here was what was interesting. One of the first exercises he had her do was to simply be on the beach and run from one lifeguard tower to the next. And the goal was just to be able to run consistently from point A to point B. She gets halfway there, and she just stops, breaks down, and starts crying. And it wasn't that she couldn't continue to run. It was the deepest emotional wound she had felt that she was someone who had actually been adopted, had loving parents, beautiful parents, but the fact that she felt abandoned, given away, that her real parents didn't love her. And that was the issue. And I thought, wow, that is a really fascinating way to look at something like this.
Oh, it is incredible. People who, I deal with people who have substantial amounts of weight to lose and have struggled with it their entire life. And it's never about weight. It's always about what's deeper and what's under the surface. At the core of really the type of work that I do, and at the heart of Fat to Fearless, both the book and the program, is the understanding that the subconscious mind, one of the functions of the subconscious mind is to always prove itself right. Mm-hmm. And that relates directly to core beliefs. So if you have events from your childhood that have given you the core beliefs that I'm unlovable, I'm not good enough, I'm unworthy, your subconscious mind doesn't argue. It says, okay, if that's what you believe. And so it begins to orchestrate your life, even unaware, consciously you're unaware of it, but it begins to do things to help prove those beliefs right. And being overweight is a great way to prove in a society that puts, thin on a pedestal, so to speak. Being overweight is a great way to prove that you're unlovable, that you're unworthy, that you're not good enough, and you don't realize you're proving that to yourself, through these subconscious mechanisms. So whatever beliefs she had from, let's say from that experience, being abandoned, I'm not good enough, no one wants me, I guarantee you that her subconscious mind took that and said, okay, hey, if you believe this, we're not going to argue, we're just going to prove you're right. And that weight was a mechanism that allowed her through relationships and other things feel abandoned, feel unloved, feel unworthy, all of that. So until you get underneath and really change that core belief, you're never really going to be able to budge that weight very much. You can lose it to a particular point, but then, just like a thermostat, your subconscious is going to go, whoa, we don't really believe that we're worthy of what we think is going to come with losing this weight, and it begins to sabotage you.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're going to touch on, there's three primary mechanisms you talk about in the book about the subconscious mind and how it uses these things to actually hold the existing beliefs you have. But first of all, what I would like you to do for our listeners is, what was the turning point for you? I mean, here you were 300 pounds, you ended up losing 120 pounds, and yet you were somebody who was running all these facilities here to help people to achieve, optimum health. What was the turning point for you? What clicked?
Well, I think that really what clicked for me was, none of these issues exist in a vacuum.
No.
Meaning that, again, being overweight is a reflection of these types of subconscious core beliefs, and that's not only going to show up in weight, that's going to show up in personal relationships and finance and all of these areas. And as I began to look at, not only am I overweight, but man, I'm attracting some really unhealthy people into my life for, personal relationships. I'm sabotaging myself, financially. What's going on underneath the surface that's causing me to think that I don't deserve all the things that I want. Mm-hmm. And, I think it was really just kind of a cumulative effect where it was like, something's got to change. But it was that coupled with the fact that, one of the great advantages that I had was the objectivity of seeing this happening with my clients. I was able to see with them that, okay, because very early on in my early 20s, even before I had these personal training studios, I was working with clients in fitness. I was a medical exercise specialist at about that time, and I was able to see that these people, it really was something underneath the surface. It really was something deeper that needed to be addressed. So having that objectivity allowed me to apply it to myself and realize that, okay, something's got to change here. So as I began to study, go to school, get various credentials, and apply them to my clients, I was able to in turn apply it to myself.
So what did you discover your core beliefs were that caused you to be the way you were?
A lot of it had to do with feelings of being unlovable, unworthy. I grew up in a home where my parents were older, and they moved around a lot, because they could. They were kind of retired. So every year we, would kind of frequently end up somewhere new. So, I never really had a lot of friends as a child. I never was really very introverted. And, essentially I just kind of, developed these beliefs of being unlovable. Why don't I have friends? And that, it snowballed, so to speak, through some of those mechanisms that we talked about, or that you mentioned, that cause the subconscious mind to prove yourself right. Mm-hmm. So, it kind of began there, and then from there I began eating to feel better, which, I grew up in a home where, my parents came from a generation long before anyone ever thought about diets or healthy eating or that sort of thing. So it was some pretty unhealthy eating habits that were modeled. So even from that early age, I began to turn to food to feel better. And then as I gained weight, it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It became a cycle because I was overweight. I didn't have a lot of friends in school, or at least I felt that was the reason, which again reinforced those negative feelings, which caused me to turn even more so to food, which as I grew older made, dating, more difficult, which again reinforced the negative feelings and caused me to turn again to food. So it's just kind of a cycle that keeps going.
It's pretty fascinating how the mind works. I was talking with a neurologist some time ago, and fascinating book, and in there she was talking about how the mind takes a lot of energy to be able to run the systems of the body, Then on top of that, you put it through the process of thinking and memory and all the other things that it does. So what the mind really seeks to do is to become very efficient about how this energy is used. So when you begin to create a habit, the mind says, okay, great, this is what you want to do. I'm going to find the most efficient way to operate so that we can go ahead and do this thoughtlessly. Example, when you first learn to drive, it's not so easy. You're trying to get the coordination and look around to see what's going on, all while stepping on the gas and moving a 2,000 to 3,000 pound vehicle at various speeds. Eventually, as you drive and you gain more experience and you get the habit, pretty soon you can pretty much drive thoughtlessly. Okay, and it's pretty interesting how all that works. So when people decide they want to shift gears and do something different, they wonder why it's so hard to do that. It's because, well, now the mind says, oh, we're going to do something different. Just when I thought I had everything running optimally and easily and efficiently, you want to go ahead and make a change. Well, it's going to struggle with that, and soon the old voices will come in and say, why do you really want to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and do that half-mile run, for instance, when, it's kind of cozy in bed here, and besides, you ran 2 days ago, and you start talking yourself out of this new habit that you want to create. That's really the mind, she says, working to try to become efficient. But if you stay with it and work with it and maybe eliminate some of those voices that tell you, no, wasn't the old way better? But if you kind of go and realize that's really what's happening, it gets a lot easier to create those new habits, as you're talking about here. But let's talk about the 3 primary mechanisms you describe in your book about the subconscious mind. And the first one being the critical gateway, I think, is a really important one for people to understand.
Sure, absolutely. And these 3 mechanisms, very much work to do what you just said. One of the modalities I work in is neurolinguistic programming, and I personally studied with Richard Bandler, who was one of the 2 creators of NLP.
Great founder of NLP, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Great guy. And he, frequently talks about how the brain is essentially a patterning machine. That's what it's seeking to do. And that whole process you just talked about, for instance, of driving the car, is the process of the brain going from conscious, taking something that you're doing consciously, and then, over time and repetition, making it unconscious so you no longer have to think about it. And these 3 mechanisms preserve a lot of those unconscious behaviors and beliefs or what have you. And the challenge is that those behaviors that give us the most trouble, we don't even remember forming them because quite frequently they happened in childhood. Mm-hmm. We learn these things at such a young age that we don't even remember it. It's just a pattern now that we have, that unconscious pattern. But essentially, there are 3 mechanisms that we look at that make it very hard to change beliefs unless you have a program like the one that I put together, in fact, that specifically addresses these things. And the critical gateway, and it's sometimes called the critical factor or the critical area of the mind, is essentially a psychological mechanism that separates the conscious and the subconscious. So when we're very young, we really don't have a critical gateway. It's a filtering mechanism is what it is, but it forms as our beliefs form. So as children, we don't really have those core beliefs yet, and so there's really no filtering mechanism in place. So everything goes into the subconscious. And that's why as children, we're able to learn so quickly. You know, if you've been in a home where multiple languages are spoken, and there's a 4 or 5 year old that's speaking multiple languages, that's a great example. But if you think of the amount of information we absorb at such a young age, reading, writing, walking, cultural norms, language, all of that, that's pretty impressive when we look at how much that slows down as we get older. And the reason is that that all goes directly into the subconscious. As we get older, we form beliefs, and beliefs become the basis of this critical gateway. And essentially what the critical gateway's job is it's part of that mechanism that's designed, that the subconscious has to prove itself right. So essentially what it does is it looks at new information that comes in and says, is this compatible with our existing beliefs? And if it is, it's allowed basically to go into the subconscious and resonate at that deeper level. And if not, it's simply rejected. So, one of the great examples of this that I could give is, let's say that you have the belief that you're not good enough. That's a core belief you have from some type of events that were formed in childhood. Someone comes along and says, let's say Sally has this belief. Sally has 10 people come along and say, Sally, you're awesome. You did a great job today. Or, Sally, you're beautiful, or whatever it is. And Sally hears that and takes that in. It reaches the critical factor, and the critical factor basically, and not that this is exactly how it works, but it's a great way of looking at it. Mm-hmm. The critical gateway says to the subconscious, hey, this person just said we're amazing. Is that true? And the subconscious mind says, no, we believe we're unworthy and we're not good enough. So that information is rejected. So if you know people in your life that tend to feel as if they're not good enough, and no matter how many compliments they get, it just seems to bounce right off. That's that subconscious or that critical gateway working. On the reverse of that, somebody could come along, she could have 20 positive compliments and they bounce right off the critical factor, but somebody could come up to Sally and give her the slightest bit of criticism, and all of a sudden, wow, man, she felt that. Mm-hmm. And, that really got to her. Compliments didn't, but that one piece of criticism did, and that's the critical gateway. It works in conjunction with your existing core beliefs to reject new information that comes along that's inconsistent with those beliefs. So it's very hard to change your beliefs when all of the incoming information in life that reaches the subconscious is only the information that confirms what you already believe.
And I would think, too, I remember an exercise that was shared with me by someone some years ago, and that is, pay attention to your thoughts. What do they say to you? And so when you're talking about how this Sally gets showered with compliments, but they kind of go unnoticed to the point where somebody comes and says something critical and, oh, yeah, you're right, even though that hurts. You can
right.
kind of see how the body's really trying to communicate to you, hey, this just isn't working for us anymore. Your divine birthright is to be happy.
Right. Well, and that goes right into that second mechanism, which is really the inner critic, which is that voice, that negative voice inside your head that tends to perpetuate these feelings, which is, man, you really aren't good enough, Sally. You really do need to try harder. We won't pick on Sally anymore. We'll say Frank. But, likewise, it's that voice that comes along, the same voice when someone gives you a compliment and says, they probably didn't mean that. They were just trying to make you feel better. So that inner critic is the second, mechanism. And part of that is learning, like you said, pay attention to that voice in your head. But part of it is learning to separate those voices in your head into kind of the different what's called ego states, so to speak, so that you understand what's actually going on. And essentially there are three primary components, we're kind of simplifying here, but, three primary components that we look at. One is kind of just your adult rational self. The second is your inner child, which is that emotional component that was kind of your original self. And the third is this inner critic, this voice who their job is essentially to work in conjunction with that critical gateway to preserve your negative core beliefs. And when you're able to separate those voices, and in fact, the Fearless I go through and I explain the psychological origin of these voices. And when you understand that the inner critic isn't really you, it's essentially a self-sustaining program that you installed from childhood that's designed to keep you in line with where you learn to believe you should be. When you're able to realize that voice isn't real, it's not really you, it's just this program that you had installed at a very young age you didn't realize that when it was happening, you're able to depersonalize it, separate it from it, and go through various processes. You can really disempower that voice, and also, as you begin to change those core beliefs, even change it to a more positive one.
Mm-hmm. Now, the second one is a reticular activating system. Tell us about what this is.
Sure. Whereas in the inner critic and the critical gateway are basically psychological constructs, the R.A.S, or the reticular activating system, is the one of these three that's actually a physical component of the brain. It's part of your brainstem. And the R.A.S serves a lot of purposes, a lot of functions, but as it pertains to what we're talking about, it's one of the neurological filtering mechanisms that determines what goes into your conscious versus your subconscious. Every minute we're exposed to millions of bits of information that comes in through our five senses, but we can only become consciously aware of about 20 of those. So the reticular activating system is one of the things that determines which of those, all of that information that's coming in, we become consciously aware of. Now, one of the best examples of this is if we look at parents, if we look at a mom on a playground. Let's say that she's talking to three other mothers deep in conversation, and there are 30 kids out there yelling and screaming. No one, other than that parent could differentiate her child from anyone else. It's, to me, it would just sound like, a big bunch of noise. But her child could make the slightest bit of a scream or a whimper or what have you, and she's going to instantly be able to clue into that. And that's because one of the things the R.A.S does for her is it says, hey, any information that comes in related to the safety of our child, we need to be aware of. Mm-hmm. So out of all of the millions of bits of information, it's, anything that it perceives related to the safety of our child is immediately filtered conscious awareness. Now, how it works in relationship to this is anything related to kind of that survival mechanism, certainly the R.A.S is going to push to conscious awareness. But it also, underneath that, its next priority is going to be bringing information to conscious awareness that is compatible with the existing belief systems. Mm-hmm. So again, if we go back to believing, I'm always going to be abandoned, or I'm always unworthy, or I'm unlovable, it's going to search through all of that information, and it's going to bring that to conscious awareness. So let's say that I have the belief that, there are no opportunities out there and that I'm a loser, and I got that from childhood. I could be at a party, and let's say I'm looking for a job. I'm ready to take my career to the next level. Consciously, I believe that, but subconsciously, I don't believe that. I could be at a party, and there could be somebody standing right next to me talking about the perfect job for me that they're looking for someone to fill, and I might not even hear or notice that. Meanwhile, because the R.A.S is going to say, hey, that's not really compatible with our existing beliefs. Whereas then there could be someone on the other side of me having a conversation about, man, the economy is horrible, and there's just no opportunities out there. I will hear and notice that conversation. Mm-hmm. So the R.A.S is a biological component that kind of works with the inner critic and the critical gateway to, again, make sure that the only information we're getting is information consistent with our existing beliefs.
Asher, it's so interesting that you put this into the perspective that you did, because I was just thinking as you were describing this, how, for instance, you were saying you could be in a room and you have this belief that the economy is bad and you're just never going to get that right job. Somebody comes along and they say pretty much what you believe. And what is it inside of us that we seem drawn to that, where, for lack of a better way to describe it, it kind of makes us feel good to know that misery is true, so to speak. But it's not really a good feeling. I would think comfortable or familiar, but good kind of goes with that, too. It's sort of like there's a payoff in that situation, isn't there?
Right. Sure. Well, and I think that, comfort, the fact that it's comfortable and it's familiar, to most people is good. And that's a big part of it. One of the metaphors or analogies that I use in the book is, our beliefs are designed to keep us in line with what we've already experienced and what we've already believed, because that's kept us alive so far. And we could, in the book, I trace it back to, understanding the evolutionary roots of this. But essentially, it's kind of like, I use the analogy of, when people believed the world was flat. That was a pretty safe belief to have, because, hey, as long as, nobody ever fell off the edge of the world by believing that, and that's what we believe. But if we try to change our beliefs, maybe the world is round and we actually sail all the way out there, there is that possibility that, hey, we could fall off the end of the world. So that mechanism in the mind is really designed to say, hey, maybe our beliefs are wrong, but it's kept us alive so far. So it's kept us functional. We may not be happy. We may not be where we want to be, but we're here and we understand this, we know how it works, and we know that we'll probably be here tomorrow if we continue to believe these same things.
I can't help but touch on that world is flat thing, as I just discovered about 3 years ago how interesting that really is. I remember it was in the 5th grade when my teacher was addressing the class about Christopher Columbus. And I remember that he said he was commissioned to go out to find out and discover whether or not the world was round, and this was his words. And because they would see the ships sail to the horizon, eventually they would disappear, so they believed the world was flat. So allegedly, back in Christopher Columbus's day, they believed, and this is in the 1400s, as we all know the 1492 story, is that, they believed the world was flat. And what's really fascinating about this story is how untrue it was then, that was a belief then. And I'll tell you why. It was really discovered that the founder of Cornell University decided to put together a book of history that he implement into his curriculum. He was the one that originally stated that there was a belief that the world was flat, and this was in the late 1800s. That the Greeks, actually thousands of years ago, knew the world was round and could accurately tell you to almost within 1 foot how big and round the world was. When I heard this, I was like, I wonder how many other historical facts I've been fed are true. But the thing is, a lot of times people take information in. You could be watching these shows you see on television, for instance, the doctors, or there's, a whole slew of these medical professionals that are now doing shows telling us how we should live, and how we'll take that information because it's on TV, or it's in a magazine, or in a newspaper, on the radio, and they'll take this information passively and say, this must be a fact, so I should do this, without really looking into it a little further for themselves. Right. I would guess you really take care of your clients to say, you really want to know this stuff for yourself.
Right, absolutely. People tend to absorb that information, which, serves a couple purposes. One, either, again, confirms those beliefs, and two, is kind of that easy solution that keeps them from having to look deeper, and commenting on what you said about, Christopher Columbus and the Greeks, what's interesting about that is, if we look at different cultures that may have believed the world is flat, and then we look and we say, okay, well, there was actually cultures thousands of years before that knew the world was round. What it really comes down to is information sharing, and it comes down to groups of people clustering together, not looking beyond themselves. And what's really relevant about that is that we tend to evolve our environments to support us in our subconscious beliefs. And what that means is, if you look around at your friends, the people that you associate with, they're going to be people that are there that are helping to preserve these beliefs for you. Mm-hmm. So, whether it's, these beliefs about being unlovable, unworthy, not good enough, that quite frequently leads to emotional eating, you can look and you can see that, it's a popular phrase or adage about, if you want to know who you are, look at your 5 closest friends or what have you. But typically, it's, one of the things that people do that kind of go through these radical changes is they kind of begin looking at their lives and who they associate with and how they interact with these people. And as they begin to make these changes, a lot of those things change as well.
Funny stuff when you think about the people you surround yourself with. I'm remembering this thing this friend of mine showed me one time, and it was at a point where I was, having a cocktail in a bar and associating with some people that were known as regulars. And what it said here is that half of the people that you know are below average. I thought, what timing. It really changed my perspective. I didn't start going there anymore. I was like, this isn't how I want to be anymore. Now, how long does it usually take as someone, there's a lot of work to do in here. What I've noticed is there isn't a whole lot about counting calories. And we do know that eating good food is very important because you eat really for energy and enjoyment more than anything. Food should be pleasurable. It's interesting how in the United States, we have a theme about food where it's fuel, it's energy, to get us going. But you take a look at France, and they eat because they eat for the pleasure and the enjoyment of it. Yet you don't see a whole lot of fat people in France.
True, and a lot of that would be, again, looking at a lot of the cultural beliefs. Here if we look at kind of a cause and effect, and we look at this, again, the subconscious mechanism designed to prove us right, if we have these core beliefs of I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable, I'm unworthy, I'm going to be abandoned, whatever it is, in a culture that prizes, being extremely thin and looking like the people on the magazines, being overweight's a great way to, again, prove that to yourself, for that subconscious mechanism to work. When you look at different countries that don't so much, link those two concepts, the subconscious mind doesn't necessarily work in that way in that culture. To do that. So in Western civilization, if we look at the United States specifically, it's a very strong connection, a very powerful link.
And the funny thing is, too, is that you'll hear from people who have that ideal aesthetic look that we believe we're supposed to be, according to those out there who are trying to pitch products at you, is that a lot of them just don't feel any better than somebody who's overweight.
No, absolutely. As a matter of fact, one of the stories in my book is that I went from 300 pounds to actually being in fitness model shape. I was actually going to start doing fitness modeling and had begun that process, and I was, kind of that, ideal. But I had done it through essentially a lot of, and willpower is kind of a different psychological mechanism, but we'll say willpower, putting a lot of pressure on myself. I didn't really change those core beliefs. And when I had that appearance, I was just as miserable as I was before. If anything, I was more driven to maintain that appearance through anxiety, and eventually ended up regaining the weight. I was never quite that large again, but, I gained a substantial amount of weight after that. And when I look back, probably the period of time that I was, that fitness ideal, was certainly very much one of those times that I look back and I think, man, I had the most work to do on myself then.
Now, it must be very encouraging as people read Fat to Fearless, and I want to encourage the listeners out there, this isn't something that's going to preach about how exercising daily is good for you, eating the right foods are good for you, but it's doing the right things just because they're the right things for you to do for a very healthy emotional lifestyle. Well, I think once that's in place, your ideal weight will be there. You probably won't look like someone in a magazine or, on a television reality show, but you will look and feel exactly like you should because that's who you authentically are. And I see that that's what your book really brings through. It's that authenticity that we're searching for where we have our own voice.
Right, exactly. It's kind of that homeostatic place between your emotions and your body. Quite frequently I'll have clients that come in, or people that do the Fat to Fearless program, and initially they'll come in and they'll say, oh man, I want to look like, whoever, or they'll give me a weight that's consistent with some type of, model that's, pretty thin, substantially below where they're at. At that point, I no way discourage that, but what's interesting is as they begin to heal a lot of these emotional wounds and reprogram a lot of the subconscious behavior, there usually comes a point where they've lost enough weight where, no doubt they look good, they're attractive, they're not overweight any longer, but they're not necessarily that model physique. But then they'll say to me, what, I think I'm pretty happy now. I feel good about myself. I'm no longer driven to eat emotionally. I'm not overweight. I feel attractive. And at that point, they feel as if going any further would be negative. And that's true, because if they went any further than that point, then it would be because of that kind of negative voice saying, hey, you need to look like this. But they've resolved that. Now, certainly there are people that I work with that do reach that point, because as they heal those things, that kind of is consistent with their goals and where they want to be. I've worked with people that had goals of, I really want to be in fitness. I really want to get in shape. I really want to have this type of body. And as they heal those wounds, they find that is truly an authentic goal that they have, and it's not driven by kind of negative stereotypes. And those people do reach that. So it very much is finding that body that is the physical equivalent of your healthiest emotional self.
Now, I love the stories, and I know that our listeners want to hear stories because they mostly want to relate in their world. If I decide to move in this direction to, pick up Fat to Fearless, will this really be that beacon I'm looking for that'll move me into a new life that I really yearn for? And all of us want change, but I think a lot of times people want to make changes for reasons that have nothing to do with why they want to change. In other words, I want to do this because my neighbor does that, rather than I want to do this because
Right.
I just know it fulfills me. I'll never forget when I started doing some informational interviewing about radio broadcasting many years ago. And I'll never forget this experience I had. She was actually a television producer for a local station, and she says, yeah, I'll give you 20 minutes. So I sat down and I met with her, and she just kind of looked me over with this sort of a leer, almost a sense that there was suspicion. And she simply asked me this question. She says, why do you want to pursue a career in radio? And I told her, I said, I just grew up listening to disc jockeys, and it seemed like it would be one of the most fun jobs on planet Earth. I'm a chatterbox that has always gotten in trouble in school for talking, and I think that could be an issue that I've been trying to work on here for years. But anyway, and I said, I just think I would really enjoy doing this. And then she says, okay, good, you've got my 20 minutes. She was about ready to kick me out the door. She says, if I thought you were coming because you wanted money and you wanted fame, I wouldn't have even wasted a minute with you. But because you've told me what you have, I'm more than happy to help you in any way that I can. And that's what I mean by those authentic changes.
Right. The great thing about the Fat to Fearless program is you get the book and begin working the program, and that really is what it is. It's a matter of working the program. The first thing is that, Fat to Fearless is not a book that you're going to buy and you're going to read all the way through and then you're automatically going to lose weight. It's a process and a program. And the great thing is it really doesn't matter what your intention is when you pick the book up, or if you, kind of begin the whole program. If you go through the process and stick with the process, those authentic things are going to come out. You may, like I said, most of the clients that come in to see me, they don't come in saying, oh man, I just want to resolve these deep emotional issues I had from childhood. That's not what they come in for. They come in, for most of my practice, a clinical hypnotherapist is the primary thing that I've kind of the shingle that's been on the door. So people come in with the idea of, oh, he's going to hypnotize me and I'm going to just stop eating.
Right.
And that's not how that mechanism works at all. And that would be a topic for another time. But they come in kind of thinking about those surface symptom things. But very quickly, when we begin actually doing the work, all this other stuff comes out. It's kind of like that lady you were talking about that was running. They got halfway between the lifeguard stations, and she started crying and realized it was about abandonment. She was not sitting there at lifeguard station 1 going, man, by the time I get to lifeguard station 2, I am going to have an emotional breakdown and then an emotional breakthrough. That was what she was thinking. What she just simply needed to do was make a commitment to start, even though she was thinking she was just working on the symptoms. And, subsequently the process is what takes care of it. So really it doesn't, matter what your conscious intentions are, as long as you make the commitment to go through the program. If you're looking for a quick fix, this is what I would say. If you're looking for a quick fix, and to get weight off quickly and that sort of thing, don't buy Fat to Fearless today. Buy it 6 months from now after you've tried that 3 times and it hasn't worked. Mm-hmm. The point is that most people that begin this program are people who have a lifetime of experience of knowing that, man, this whole conscious willpower thing doesn't work. This diet thing doesn't work. Because here's the thing, people that try different diets, I'm going to tell you a secret. They all work. You know, every one of them works to some degree if you stick with them long enough. Mm-hmm. But the challenge is that you can't stick with them long enough when you've got a subconscious program that says, hey, we don't deserve to be thin and happy, mm-hmm. you know? And that's always, you know, the subconscious mind is over 90% of our mental functioning. So that, you know, it's 88 to 92% is one of the more, you know, statistics that's out there. So that 8 to 12% of you that thinks, yeah, I want to be thin and I deserve it, is never going to beat that 88 to 92%. You really got to do the work.
Absolutely, and the funny thing too is that it will actually happen faster than you think it does if you just work the processes you're talking about, because take a look at how long it's taken you doing it the other way that claims to be faster.
Oh, absolutely. Most of the people that will come in, I will say to them, you know, how long have you been trying to lose this weight? 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you know, whatever it is.
Wow.
And, you know, and they've lost and they've regained it now, and they'll say, well, how long is this going to take? And I'll say, well, you know, whatever it is based on where they're at. And they'll act like that's a long time, and I'll say, well, let me ask you this. If you just lost a pound a month over the past 5 years, where would you be? You know, so it's very much one of those things. You know, one of the things I would encourage people to do is on my website, we're getting ready to send out series of instructional videos that's absolutely free that goes through the 4 primary ways your subconscious mind sabotages your weight loss and how to begin to offset that. And they can get that for free at my website, which is AsherFoxWeightLoss.com. It's just altogether AsherFoxWeightLoss.com, and they can get that. And that's a good place for them to start if they're not quite ready to go to Amazon and pick up Fat to Fearless, and they just want to know more about what it is about and how it all works. They can just sign up for those free videos, and they'll get those in their email.
And because I really believe in what you have here in between these pages based on years and years of talking with people on different things, to let the listeners know at Beyond50Radio.com as we set up a special page for this. We'll also have a link there. And you also have a radio show people can tune into.
That's true. Yeah. If you actually, when they sign up for the radio show, launches right after the first of the year, and we're going to have a variety of topics in terms of, you know, it's about relationships, and that's relationships with others and relationships with yourself. So you're going to kind of learn how this relationship with your own inner self impacts your life on multiple levels, as well as impacts your relationship with other people. And actually, when they sign up for those free videos, they'll also get the announcements of the launch of the radio show after the first of the year, and they'll get a link to also be able to go directly and listen to the radio show.
Well, Asher Fox, it's certainly not only been a pleasure to have you here on the program to talk about this, to kind of enlighten our listeners out there. Quit listening to all the stuff out there and really start listening to yourself, and that's what this book starts with. Listen to what's going on with inside of you, and let's take one step at a time, and you'll find yourself in a very natural state. This isn't to become a supermodel, although that could be an outcome, but it's about just being genuinely happy about who you are, and that's what Fat to Fearless is really all about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I love it. Give out that website one more time.
It's www.AsherFoxWeightLoss.com, ASHERFOX, weightloss.com, and they can sign up there, and they'll get the free instructional video series, as well as they'll get the announcements about the radio show when it starts after the first of the year.
Very good. Well, Asher Fox, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
And thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You betcha. There you go. So if you're going to start your New Year's Eve resolution by losing that weight, why don't we take a look at those inner beliefs that caused that in the first place, if that's what actually happened. We also encourage you to visit us at Beyond50Radio.com and sign up for our free weekly e-news updates. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.